Son of Grendel, Chapter 1, A Significant Death. Robert Dalton lay on his belly atop the carpet of pine needles and dead leaves covering the forest floor. A bead of sweat slithered from underneath his dark hair and dripped off his forehead before it could reach his prominent nose. His thick hands clutched a stolen old-world repeating rifle. Below the Insurgents' hilltop hiding place lay a dirt road leading to a wooden bridge, and on that road marched Grendel's Obsidian Guard, black uniforms against a sea of green and brown. Red-haired Jack Chisholm lay beside him, eyes also locked on the enemy. The wind rolled over them, carrying with it the smell of horses and sweaty men. From what sympathizers upriver said, 3 companies were marching south from Jenner's Ford. These must be the pickets, the scouts. The main force couldn't be far behind. A scowl crossed Dalton's narrow face at the thought of his lost hometown. The folk of Jenner's Ford had believed they'd escaped the worst of Grendel's conquest, but then the Obsidian Guard had come to town one afternoon after last year's harvest. The townsfolk had a week to gather up their possessions and leave so hundreds of Grendel's Jow veterans could be settled in their place. They'd marched 30 miles east under the guns of Grendel's men to what would become their new town, Jennerston. Not all had made it. Dalton gritted his teeth at the memory of how Grandpa didn't wake up after that first night traveling when they'd all had to bed down beside the road. They'd found him curled up beneath a tree, cold as the morning air. Though some guardsmen wanted to make them leave his body for the ravens, pterodactyls, and other vermin, the commander ultimately allowed them to bury him by the roadside. Should have let us take him to the new settlement. And once they'd arrived, they'd found the hilly country troublesome for their wheat, oats, and barley. They'd managed to get a corn crop in, but hadn't yielded much in the unfamiliar rocky land. Between grain lost to move or stolen by guardsmen and think they'd been noticed, the townsfolk didn't have enough to feed themselves over the coming winter without eating most of their seed grain. To their collective shame, they'd had to go to where they'd once been freeholders and beg for jobs tied them over till summer. Luckily, the veterans, mostly amber-skinned Jow, more used to growing rice than wheat, were worse farmers than soldiers. They'd paid the freeholders in gold dollars, bearing the same saber-cat insignia as their black caps. A grim smile lit Dalton's blue eyes. Not all were willing to lick the hand holding the whip. 2 weeks before, one stole a repeater. He'd heard the Jow bastard who'd lost it was hanged for his foolishness, and his new farm turned over to someone else. Served him right. He'd gotten himself killed, and he'd kindly given them a precious repeater and some magazines. And the thief brought word that an Obsidian Guard detachment was heading south soon after stopping at Jenner's Ford. "Just a little closer," Chisholm muttered. "Come over the bridge, you bastards." Chisholm had been a corporal in the army of the Camrose Confederation. Some had wanted to attack the scouts riding ahead of the rest or blow the bridge as soon as the first guardsmen were on it, but Chisholm had a better idea. Let the mounted scouts pass. Then, once the pickets crossed, blow the bridge with a bomb made with almost all their loose gunpowder. The logic was beautiful. Separate a few men from the bulk of the column, kill them, and liberate their weapons. Grendel's minions would pay for stealing their homes. The enemy pickets approached the bridge. The thunder of footsteps behind them indicated the main column wasn't far. His hands tightened on his weapon. The plan relied on the column being too far away to immediately support the pickets. Every second counted. Cross the bridge, damn it. That was key to the plan. The bridge is old and finally got the repairs it needed. Only these repairs involved an explosive trap. Only the heaps of leaves and debris concealing the cable running from under the bridge up the hill hinted something was amiss. Dalton prayed to the good Lord the enemy didn't see that. The pickets began to cross. Once they were on the other side, Chisholm slashed his right hand. Dalton's own hand trembled, but he obeyed. He forced a plunger down into the boxy detonator. Nothing happened. Dalton's gaze snapped back across the bridge. The first ranks of the main column were in sight. His gut twisted. Was something wrong with the wires? The column was getting closer. If they crossed the bridge, the freeholders had to beat feet or die. A succession of thunderclaps broke the morning air. White smoke swallowed the bridge and the guardsmen on it. Splintered wood and bits of stone flew. Blood stained the debris falling around him like hard rain. The acrid stench of spent gunpowder stirred the morning's breakfast in his stomach. The stranded pickets shouted orders, abandoning their horses before the growing cloud of gray smoke. They spread out, their repeaters' narrow barrels leering into the forest like dark, evil eyes. Dalton's head trembled. Chisholm leaned forward beside him, eyes on the enemy. "Now!" Chisholm snatched up his repeater and flicked the switch on his side to auto. Dalton followed a moment later. Though keeping the weapon from bucking upward took all of Dalton's strength, he and Chisholm wreaked havoc. Guardsmen fell, so did horses. One panicked horse raced off in the woods, trampling a guardsman beneath its hooves. The remaining guardsmen scattered behind the rocks and trees nearest the broken bridge. Dalton flicked the switch back to fire and scrambled down the hill. "Get those repeaters and any ammo you can find," Chisholm ordered, gesturing to the nearest dead guardsman. "I'll cover you." The guardsman leaned out from behind a tree, repeater rising toward Dalton. Chisholm fired. The guardsman ducked back. "Go!" Bobbing and weaving as he ran, Dalton rushed over to two fallen foes. He seized one man's weapon and looped the sling around his shoulder and tore the ammunition box off the dead man's belt. Quick glance back showed the smoke was beginning to clear. The front ranks of column beyond the bridge were beginning to materialize. So much for snatching up even more repeaters. A repeater chattered within the column. The first bullet snapped past, but he only had one repeater. He swallowed. "Cover my ass!" he shouted at Chisholm. He scrambled forward and grabbed another repeater, kicking the wounded guardsman until he let go. More repeaters chattered. Carrying his prizes, Dalton scrambled back up the hill. A bullet slammed to the butt of one of the liberated repeaters. He tumbled face first to the ground. Blood trickling from his split lip, he crawled up the hill, hoping the next bullet didn't hit him in the head. Dalton spared a glance behind him. Although Chisholm kept firing, the first ranks of guardsmen were picking their way across a bridge that wasn't completely broken. Shit. A couple enemies stopped to help wounded comrades. Most kept coming. The two men scrambled up the hill to where others waited to ambush the enemy with shorter-ranged regular rifles. The guardsmen didn't disappoint. In ones and twos, they broke away from the main body to dash forward and take cover. Soon they'd be crawling up the hill like ants. Something whistled overhead. "Mortars!" Chisholm shouted. "Hit the dirt!" Both men slammed to the ground. A moment later, a fiery mushroom rose to their right. Splinters whipped through the air. One sliced across Dalton's left arm just above the elbow, striking like a scorpion with a knife for a tail. He hissed in pain, but kept hold of precious weapons. Screams echoed all around. Several freeholders broke cover and opened fire. The Obsidian Guard below replied, their thunder drowning out that of the rebels. "Everyone get the fuck down!" Chisholm shouted. Most obeyed. A few didn't. Above Dalton, sandy-haired Tommy Daniels surged his feet and ran. He didn't get far before a bullet caught him in the back of the neck and blew out his throat in a crimson explosion. He toppled, his rifle falling from his hands. "Shit!" Dalton snarled. The boy was 14. He should still be learning his trade, his uncle's carpenter shop, or courting his first girl, not lying dead in the mud in the woods. And he wasn't the only one. 4 freeholders lay dead or wounded on the hill. A fifth of their force in one stroke. Dalton dumped the repeaters he captured and fired his own at the oncoming enemy. One guardsman tumbled down the hill. He drew a bead on another, but a scream to his left broke through the ringing in his ears. One freeholder tumbled, a tiny hole in his forehead and a huge hole gaping above the nape of his neck. More repeaters chattered, this time from the bulk of the column across the river. More lead sliced through the trees. "Blast it all," Chisholm snarled. "We'll have to get back to the fallback position and the waterfall." He looked straight at Dalton. "You and I will bring up the rear." Dalton swallowed and looked behind him. They built a triangle of earth-packed logs above the ambush site. If things went south, that might provide some temporary shelter before they could run for the waterfall caves. Now, getting there would be the hardest part. The trees might provide some protection from bullets. There was a lot of lead flying in 2 different directions. But Chisholm knew what he was doing. Dalton nodded. Chisholm returned to the others. "The rest of you get to the fallback position," he shouted over the whining bullets. "Shoot and goddamn scoot. Leave no wounded behind." The freeholders fired. Some continued shooting, white smoke shrouding their prone forms. Others crawled on their bellies across leafy ground toward the makeshift fort. 2 men carried a wounded man with them. The enemy continued up the hill. Some scrambled forward in protected positions while their fellows fired. Then they switched. The freeholders' fire didn't even slow them. Another mortar shell whistled. Dalton checked the urge to close his eyes. If the explosion were close, he'd die whether he could see it or not. Thunder cracked behind him. Men screamed. A brief glance back showed mangled bodies. Several survivors stood and ran, heedless of the guards behind them. Some threw themselves behind the logs. A couple kept running. Men fell, bullets burying themselves in their backs or tearing through their heads. Half the freeholders were dead or had fled. The ones who'd made it to safety thankfully remembered the shoot part of shoot and scoot. White smoke soon shrouded the fallback point. The gunfire forced the oncoming guardsmen into cover. Dalton squeezed the trigger. One bullet sank into a fallen tree behind which 2 guardsmen sheltered. The other caught a guardsman in the shoulder. The repeater clicked empty. He pulled the curving magazine from beneath the repeater and tore another from his jacket. He needed more cautious with this one. "Now you scoot," Chisholm shouted in his ear. Dalton snatched up the stolen repeaters and scrambled up the hill toward the shelter. Along the way, his elbows and knees sank into black earth now wet with blood. He pulled himself over loops of intestine and hot lumps of other organs. His gorge rose. He swallowed it back down. He wouldn't sully his fellows' bodies with his vomit. Bullets cracked over his head. The ground dipped below the fallback point. He could shoot from there, giving Chisholm the chance to get out, as long as there weren't any more mortars. Dalton scrambled into the dip. Chisholm remained on his belly, his weapon chattering. There were men near him, but one had his brains scooped out by a bullet. Dalton slammed a fresh magazine to the repeater and fired again. An advancing pair of guardsmen ducked out of sight. Chisholm and the others began crawling toward the redoubt. The guardsmen quickly took advantage. One loped forward, throwing a grenade at the fleeing men. Dalton squeezed the trigger, sending the guardsmen sprawling. A grenade exploded a second later, peppering two of the crawling men with shrapnel. Neither moved after that. "Hurry!" Dalton shouted. Chisholm and the two other survivors scrambled up the hill and threw themselves next to Dalton. The trio thumbed bullets in their ammunition tubes and rammed them back into the butts of their rifles. The guardsman approached. A towering blonde knelt by one of the freeholders left behind. He drew a knife from a boot sheath. Chisholm fired, hot brass flying past Dalton's face. The shot missed, but the guardsman slipped back. He wouldn't finish the man off, not yet. "We can't stay here," Chisholm snarled. "Goddamn mortar." He paused. "Dalton, you scoot. We'll shoot. Then we switch." Dalton nodded and crawled toward the log wall. Behind him, the survivors traded fire with the guardsman. Until he got to the shelter, he's an even bigger target, especially with the repeaters on his back. He jumped up and ran, zigzagging as he rushed toward the fallback position. Bullets buzzed through the air around him. He threw himself behind the palisade, landing next to three men already sheltering there. Bullets thumped against the logs behind him, but none penetrated, for the moment. He risked a glance over the top. Two squads of Obsidian Guard crawled toward them all. The ones further back fired over their heads. If only he had a grenade or two, he'd keep them at bay. But he didn't have a grenade. "There are three of you here," he said. "I've got spare repeaters. Take them, but don't leave your rifles." The men eagerly snatched up the new weapons. The quartet fired at the advancing guardsmen. One fell, with the others retreating into cover. "Come on!" Dalton shouted. Chisholm and the remaining freeholders scrambled up the hill. Bullets buzzed around them. One man slumped forward. The rest scrambled safely behind the logs. Dalton counted. They started with 21 men. Between the ones who'd fled and the ones with him, they'd had 10. They captured a few repeaters, but their losses, he doubted they'd had the good end of the bargain. Chisholm peeked over the palisade. "We stay here, we're meat for the mortars and grenades." He pointed northeast. "We'll have to shoot and scoot again." The enemy bullets thumping into the barricade behind them slowed. Maybe the enemy is running low on ammo. The freeholders have better odds if they did. But the guardsmen did have mortars. Any minute those goddamn shells start falling again. Dalton pointed northeast. "It's a straight shot to the waterfall that way. It'll take us close to the river." Chisholm frowned. When he opened his mouth to argue, whistling filled the air. Oh, shit. Dalton threw himself down, praying to the good Lord the shell would land outside the redoubt. Light flashed. Dirt erupted from between the logs as the shell shook the ground. Smoke shrouded most of the fallback point. Dalton looked up. The world swam. Chisholm grabbed Dalton by the arm. "Now, while we can. Don't leave any weapons." The freeholders rushed up the path leading to the waterfall, keeping as low as they could while still being on their feet. Only Chisholm occasionally stopped to fire into the cloud of smoke left behind them. Someone screamed. The path carried them close to the gorge. Bullets from the other side whipped around them. Across the river, a line of Obsidian Guard knelt, with another line standing behind them. Behind the second line stood a tall Jow. His uniform was more elaborate, 2 lines of brass buttons running up the front and gold braided his wrists. A bullet caught the shorter freeholder head of Dalton in the leg. The man screamed. Another bullet caught him in the head. Dalton stumbled over the body and fell to the ground. Bullets passed through where he'd been. He threw a murderous glance at the enemy across the river. The tall bastard was probably the commander. Whatever happened to the freeholders, he wouldn't be coming out of this scrap alive. Dalton raised his repeater and squeezed the trigger twice. The first round caught the tall Jow in the collar. The second struck him in the cheek. Shouts of dismay rippled through the ranks of guardsmen. Their firing slackened for 1 critical second. Dalton dashed through the gap in the trees. A bullet sliced across his right calf. His knees kissed the bloody ground. The bullets kept buzzing. Most seemed to be behind him now, but far too many were loud and close. Someone loomed over Dalton. He looked up. "Good shot," Chisholm shouted. "Now move your fucking ass." He pulled Dalton toward the waterfall and the caves behind it offered a safe escape route. 2 nights later, despite the pain in his leg and the fact his hearing hadn't quite recovered, Dalton forded the river well south of the falls to get salt pork from his brother-in-law, Andy Barr, in Jennerston. There, he learned something that twisted his stomach in knots. According to Jane Candler, whose husband Christopher served the bastards at Jenner's Ford, the tall Jow was named Wang Fai. He wasn't just any Obsidian Guard officer. Grendel married a Jow woman to unite Sedgera out west. Barr said he stuffed the well-wrapped salt pork in saddlebags of Dalton's horse. But some folk didn't exactly cotton to that. Jow, mostly. Wang Fei kicked the asses of those who disagreed up between the shoulder blades. That was before the old bastard came east. He's one of Grendel's old campaigners. Ice water gathered in Dalton's stomach. If Wang Fei was that important to Grendel, the tyrant might take a brutal revenge. The freeholders knew their activities would provoke reprisals from the Obsidian Guard, but there was a difference between killing ordinary guardsmen and killing an enemy hero. Dalton swallowed. What's going on at Jenner's Ford? Maybe they could buy time to evacuate the town if they took the fight to the enemy. Andy spat in the dark ground. What do you think a bunch of retired soldiers are doing? Enemy settlement's a damned armed camp. They're running patrols all around. Jane said Chris wasn't allowed to leave. There's going to be hell coming down here real soon. Dalton looked around, his imagination painting black-clad guardsmen in every shadow. We need to get everyone the hell out.